In St. Mary Mead, the most inconvenient things had a habit of occurring on the most perfectly ordinary afternoons, as if fate itself possessed a peculiar sense of dramatic timing. Thursday was sewing day at the Memorial Hall, that venerable institution which managed to be both draughty and dignified, lending itself an air of civic virtue that made even the most reluctant needleworker feel she was contributing to the moral fiber of the village. The threads that bound the community together were as literal as they were metaphorical, and one could read a great deal from the evenness of a running stitch, if one were inclined to notice such things. Miss Jane Marple, who most decidedly was, had taken her customary seat by the tall windows where the autumn light fell with gentle kindness across her work. Her basket, redolent of lavender and containing a piece of ecclesiastical embroidery that had occupied her attention for the better part of 3 months, rested beside her chair. She observed the gathering with the sort of mild interest one shows for garden weather, marking the clouds, noting the wind's direction, and making small adjustments accordingly. If a storm should come, well, there were usually signs for those who knew how to read them. The Memorial Hall hummed with the comfortable sounds of domestic industry. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in her role as the afternoon's hostess, moved between the assembled ladies with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, despite the October breeze that had threatened to disturb it on her walk from the vicarage. She poured tea from the hall's best china service, a wedding gift from some long-forgotten benefactor, while discussing the upcoming harvest festival with the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested she had already anticipated and prepared for every possible catastrophe. 12 quilts by harvest time, mind you, she declared, settling a bolt of cheerful flannel on the long trestle table. Mrs. Clement has been quite specific about the color scheme this year. Nothing too bold, she insists, though one wonders what she might consider bold after last year's rather spectacular display of orange chrysanthemums. Around the table sat the usual contingent of St. Mary Mead's most dedicated needlewomen, each bringing her own particular blend of skill, gossip, and gentle eccentricity to the proceedings. Mrs. Vera Clement, the vicar's wife, worked with characteristic precision on a sampler depicting what appeared to be a rather stern-looking robin, her brow furrowed in concentration that suggested she was solving theological as well as domestic problems with each careful stitch. Miss Caroline Hartnell, whose assertive bonnet made her appear perpetually prepared for inclement weather of both meteorological and social varieties, had brought her own scissors, long, polished implements that she wielded with the authority of someone who had learned not to trust, communal cutting tools. Standards, she murmured to no one in particular, have rather slipped of late. At the far end of the circle, young Biddy Pierce moved quietly between the ladies, refilling teacups and offering biscuits with the kind of unobtrusive efficiency that made her nearly invisible. She had the soft step and attentive manner of someone who had learned to listen with her whole being, as if conversation were a complex piece of music she might master through careful attention. But it was the empty chair near the window that drew Miss Marple's particular notice. The chair, a sturdy piece with a faded chintz cushion, remained pulled out from the table at a welcoming angle, as if its occupant had merely stepped away for a moment and intended to return. A half-finished piece of needlepoint lay abandoned on the small side table beside it, depicting what appeared to be a garden scene with roses and a rather charming cottage. Next to the needlework sat a teacup, still faintly steaming, and a ginger biscuit that bore the delicate imprint of a single bite. "How long has Evelyn been away?" asked Mrs. Prudence Weatherby, the retired schoolmistress whose punctual habits and attention to detail had survived 30 years of managing village children. She glanced meaningfully at the mantel clock, whose steady tick seemed to grow more pronounced in the sudden lull of conversation. Mrs. Bantry consulted her own small watch, a delicate gold piece that had belonged to her mother. "Oh, perhaps 25 minutes now. She said she was just fetching a fresh skein of silk thread from her bag. Dove grey, I believe she said. Such a lovely shade for autumn work." Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm, but her attention sharpened like a bird's when it senses movement in the undergrowth. Mrs. Evelyn Fairfax was typically the most accomplished needleworker in their circle, her fingers moving with a precision that came from years of practice and an artist's eye for color and composition. Today, however, she had seemed unusually distracted, dropping stitches and starting over with an uncharacteristic nervousness that had manifested in frequent glances toward the windows and an odd habit of fingering the small gold locket she always wore at her throat. There had been something else, too. A quality in Mrs. Fairfax's laugh when Mrs. Clement had mentioned the new family moving into Gossington Hall. It had come a beat too late and a shade too brightly, like someone stepping onto a moving platform. Miss Marple had known a woman once who laughed in just that way when her late husband's name was mentioned in company. Grief and guilt, she had learned, could take the most peculiar shapes. The comfortable atmosphere of the sewing circle was shattered by a sound that had no place in their civilized gathering. A sharp cry that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the hall's main doors, in the direction of the small anteroom where supplies were kept. It was not quite a scream, but rather the kind of sound a person might make upon discovering something so unexpected and terrible that the voice simply refused to function properly. The effect on the assembled ladies was immediate and telling. Mrs. Bantry dropped her teacup, sending delicate china fragments scattering across the polished floor. Miss Hartnell's scissors clattered to the table. Young Biddy Pierce went perfectly still, her hand frozen halfway to the tea-urn, her face draining of color. Miss Marple set down her embroidery with deliberate care and rose from her chair with the measured movements of someone who had learned to navigate both physical limitations and life's unexpected crises with equal grace. "That came from the anteroom," she observed quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that could steady nerves and organize thoughts in moments of chaos. What they found in the small room behind the stage would forever alter their understanding of their peaceful village and the people they thought they knew so well. Mrs. Evelyn Fairfax lay motionless among the scattered contents of the supply cupboard, her elegant afternoon dress, a soft blue wool that had complemented her eyes so beautifully, now disheveled and stained. Her carefully arranged silver hair had come undone, and her face wore an expression of such profound surprise that it seemed she had encountered something entirely beyond her comprehension in those final moments. Miss Marple approached the scene with the careful observation that had served her well in previous encounters with human tragedy. While the other ladies gasped and clutched at each other in shock, she noted the position of the body, the way Mrs. Fairfax's handbag had spilled its contents across the floor, and the curious fact that the small window near the ceiling stood slightly open, though she could not recall anyone mentioning that the room had felt stuffy. Most significantly, she observed the measuring tape that lay unspooled near the skirting board, and a thread, pale blue, the exact shade of Mrs. Fairfax's dress, caught on a splinter of wood where someone might have brushed against it. The air held a faint, sweet scent that seemed oddly out of place, something floral but artificial, like violets from a bottle rather than a garden. "We must telephone the police immediately," Mrs. Bantry declared, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And Dr. Haydock, though I fear—" She could not bring herself to finish the sentence, but her meaning was perfectly clear to all present. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the peaceful routine of the St. Mary Mead sewing circle gave way to the harsh necessities of investigation and inquiry, Miss Marple found herself once again confronting the darker aspects of human nature that could lurk beneath the most civilized and familiar surfaces. The empty chair with its pulled-out position, which had seemed merely a sign of temporary absence, now took on the weight of something far more permanent and tragic. The village of St. Mary Mead was about to discover that even the most innocent of gatherings could harbor secrets, and that the gentle art of needlework could not always mend the frayed edges of human relationships when jealousy, resentment, and long-buried grievances finally came to light. "Such a pity," Miss Marple murmured, half to herself as she gazed once more at the empty chair that would never again welcome its occupant's return. Such a very great pity indeed. By nightfall, St. Mary Mead had transformed Mrs. Evelyn Fairfax's death into a collection of theories, each more elaborate than the last. The telephone at the post office rang with persistent urgency, and conversations carried over garden hedges as if the very privet had developed ears. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Giles declared it must have been a vagrant, drawn by Mrs. Fairfax's obvious prosperity, though no one could recall seeing such a person. Mrs. Price Ridley announced that she had always suspected the Memorial Hall was unwholesome, while Mr. Toms, the butcher, suggested foreign poison with the relish of a man who understood the mechanics of death. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with the brisk efficiency that had served him through 20 years of village investigations, accompanied by the local constable and Dr. Haydock. The inspector maintained a professional wariness around Miss Marple, having learned through previous encounters that certain elderly ladies possessed an uncomfortable talent for noticing what others missed. Dr. Haydock emerged from the anteroom with grave news that settled the question of natural causes once and for all. "I'm afraid this was no heart attack," he announced, removing his spectacles with unnecessary care. Mrs. Fairfax was strangled, though the method was subtle enough to suggest someone with knowledge of such matters. The bruising is minimal but unmistakable. The word murder rippled through the assembled ladies like a stone dropped in still water. Mrs. Bantry pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Mrs. Clement reached instinctively for her husband's steadying hand. Young Biddy Pierce, who had been quietly collecting scattered teacups, went perfectly still at the announcement, her face draining of color in a way that Miss Marple found particularly interesting. Inspector Slack opened his notebook with the mechanical precision of someone who had processed many such scenes. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first, did Mrs. Fairfax seem troubled recently? Any complaints, unusual behavior, anything that might suggest she felt threatened?" Miss Hartnell straightened in her chair with the air of someone remembering a crucial detail. "There was a telephone conversation yesterday evening," she said, her voice carrying the breathlessness that accompanied significant revelations. "I happened to be passing her cottage when I heard her speaking quite loudly, through the open window. Most unlike Evelyn, who was always so particular about privacy. She seemed to be saying something about not being able to go through with it, whatever it might have been." Inspector Slack's pen moved across his notebook with renewed interest. "Could you make out anything else of this conversation?" "Only that she seemed quite distressed. She kept repeating that it wasn't fair, that she had done her duty long enough. Most peculiar, really, as Evelyn was always so composed about her various responsibilities." Mrs. Clement nodded slowly. "She did seem rather nervous today. Not herself at all. She kept glancing toward the windows and fumbling with her needlework most uncharacteristically." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm as she absorbed these revelations. She had noticed Mrs. Fairfax's nervous habit of touching her locket, and now she recalled something else. The way Biddy Pierce had paused when serving tea, as if listening to something beyond ordinary conversation. The girl's reaction to the murder announcement suggested she possessed knowledge she had not yet shared. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Fairfax consulted me several weeks ago about difficulty sleeping. She seemed under considerable strain, though she was evasive about the cause. I prescribed a mild sedative, but she never returned. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the theories multiplied. Colonel Bantry suggested business rivals from her late husband's textile empire. Mrs. Clement leaned toward family difficulties, while Miss Hartnell favored romantic entanglements with mysterious overtones. Each theory reflected its proponent's particular view of human nature and village life. Miss Marple listened to these pronouncements with quiet attention, offering only gentle nods and thoughtful murmurs. Her mind, however, was already sorting through the accumulating details, the artificial violet scent that had lingered in the anteroom, the measuring tape unspooled like a pale snake, the blue thread caught on splintered wood. Most significantly, she considered the pattern of Mrs. Fairfax's final weeks, the sleeplessness, the mysterious telephone conversation, the nervous energy that had replaced her usual composed efficiency. The villagers, in their eagerness to assign blame, were constructing elaborate narratives based on prejudice and assumption. But Miss Marple understood that human nature rarely followed such convenient patterns. The truth, she suspected, lay hidden beneath layers of respectability and routine, waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough to observe the small inconsistencies that revealed the larger deceptions. When Inspector Slack finally dismissed the gathering, Mrs. Fairfax's chair remained exactly as she had left it, pulled out at that welcoming angle. The half-finished needlework lay abandoned, its garden scene forever incomplete, while somewhere in the village, Miss Marple reflected, someone was already practicing the art of appearing normally grieved rather than secretly relieved. Morning settled over St. Mary Mead with the peculiar quality that follows tragedy, as if the very air had grown more attentive to human frailties. Miss Marple took her customary constitutional pass to Ivy Cottage, where Mrs. Fairfax's garden displayed the meticulous care of someone who understood that appearances mattered even in the smallest details. The roses had been pruned with mathematical precision, yet the Morning Post lay scattered on the front path like fallen leaves, and yesterday's milk bottles stood uncollected, small violations of routine that spoke volumes about their owner's final days. Inspector Slack emerged from the cottage with the satisfied expression of a man who had discovered evidence that supported his preliminary theories. His notebook bulged with what he clearly considered significant findings, and he nodded curtly to Miss Marple, hoping to avoid another of their oblique conversations about village psychology. "Found what we were looking for," he announced with professional pride. Mrs. Fairfax was being blackmailed, Miss Marple. Regular payments of £5 monthly to someone signing themselves a friend for the past 6 months. The final demand was for £50, with threats of exposure if she refused. Miss Marple paused in her examination of the cottage's dahlia border, where the late blooms still defied the October chill. The sum struck her as curious, significant enough to cause distress, yet modest by blackmail standards. Either the secret was relatively minor, or the blackmailer possessed an unusual sense of proportion in their criminal activities. Dr. Haydock joined them, his medical bag suggesting he had been conducting his own investigation. "Most methodical woman I've ever encountered," he observed, removing his hat. "Kept detailed records of everything: expenses, correspondence, daily activities. Her appointment diary shows several mysterious entries marked only with B, and a time, suggesting meetings she was careful not to identify too specifically. The cottage's interior, according to the doctor's observations, reflected the same obsessive order as the garden. Among the perfectly arranged needlework projects, however, investigators had discovered a locked drawer containing not only the blackmail correspondence, but also a collection of newspaper clippings dating back several years. Miss Marple found this particularly illuminating. People who collected such items typically did so for reasons that went beyond casual interest in current events. At the post office, Miss Marple's strategic purchase of penny stamps yielded valuable intelligence from Miss Ellaby, who announced her discretion by immediately whispering confidential information. There had been a telephone call for Mrs. Fairfax the previous evening from Much Benham at 9:15, an odd hour that generally meant trouble. More intriguingly, Mrs. Fairfax had been receiving numerous letters from London in recent weeks, heavy cream envelopes addressed in florid handwriting that suggested something more personal than business correspondence. Young Biddy Pierce appeared near the vicarage with her basket of hymn books and eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. When Miss Marple gently inquired about Mrs. Fairfax's nervous behavior at the sewing circle, the girl's response proved illuminating. "She kept touching her locket," Biddy whispered, then added with significance, "It's gone now. I looked when they returned her things." This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly important. The small gold locket had been Mrs. Fairfax's constant companion, worn with the unconscious habit of someone seeking comfort from a treasured memento. Its disappearance suggested either theft or deliberate concealment by someone who understood its significance. Biddy also confirmed Miss Marple's observation about the artificial violet scent that had lingered in the anteroom. "Like violet sweets, only stronger," the girl described it, her face troubled by the memory. The scent had been noticeable enough to register despite the shock of discovery, suggesting it was neither subtle nor naturally occurring. Miss Marple's afternoon gardening at her front gate provided additional intelligence when Mrs. Price Ridley, unable to resist a stationary audience, revealed that Mrs. Fairfax had been seen arguing with a gentleman outside the chemist on Tuesday. The encounter had involved raised voices and a mysterious paper bag, details that suggested medical rather than social business. As Inspector Slack pursued his systematic investigation of financial motives and obvious suspects, Miss Marple found herself more intrigued by the smaller inconsistencies. The measuring tape left unspooled like a pale snake, the chair pulled out at that welcoming angle despite Mrs. Fairfax's habitual tidiness, the blue thread caught on splintered wood. These details suggested haste and intimacy, rather than premeditated crime by a stranger. The pattern emerging from her observations pointed towards someone who knew Mrs. Fairfax's habits well enough to predict her movements, yet had acted with sufficient passion to leave such telling traces behind. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident as he emerged from the Memorial Hall on Friday morning, his notebook thick with what he considered conclusive evidence. The case had resolved itself with the pleasing efficiency of a well-oiled mechanism, presenting him with Mr. Bertie Finch, the village chemist, whose nervous disposition and questionable business practices had finally caught up with him in the most decisive manner possible. The evidence against Mr. Finch mounted with each hour of investigation. A thorough search of his premises had uncovered a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a stack of pharmaceutical catalogues, its pages documenting regular payments from Mrs. Fairfax over the past 6 months. The entries, recorded in Finch's cramped handwriting, culminated in a final notation that made Inspector Slack's case for him. E.F. Final demand, $50. Exposure threatened if refused. The blackmail scheme was laid bare with mathematical precision, providing both motive and method for Wednesday's tragic conclusion. Several villagers confirmed the contentious relationship between chemist and victim. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose memory for scandal possessed photographic clarity, recounted their public argument outside the shop with theatrical relish. "He was quite beside himself, Inspector," she declared, her voice rising with remembered drama. "Mrs. Fairfax clutched that paper bag as if her life depended on it, and he practically snatched it from her hands, shouting about consequences and ruined reputations. The paper bag, investigation revealed, had contained the sedative Dr. Haydock had prescribed, establishing a clear connection between blackmailer and victim. Mr. Finch's alibi proved as substantial as morning mist. He claimed to have been arranging stock in his back room during the crucial period, a statement delivered with the nervous cough that had accompanied his explanations for years. His hands, perpetually damp with anxiety, trembled as he insisted he had heard nothing unusual from the Memorial Hall, despite his shop's proximity to the scene. The inspector's theory possessed elegant simplicity. Finch had discovered some compromising secret about Mrs. Fairfax, perhaps through his access to prescription records or village gossip, and had systematically extracted payments for months. When she finally refused his escalating demands, he had arranged to meet her at the Memorial Hall, where their argument had escalated beyond his intentions. The measuring tape, found unspooled near the body, could easily have served as an improvised ligature for someone desperate enough to silence his victim permanently. The village accepted this explanation with the relief of people who preferred their scandals to involve outsiders rather than their intimate circle. Miss Hartnell adjusted her assertive bonnet with satisfaction, declaring she had always suspected something unwholesome about the chemist. Too many chemicals, you understand? She pronounced with authority. Does something peculiar to the mind, all that exposure to unnatural substances. Miss Marple listened to these pronouncements with her customary politeness, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her mind pursued different paths entirely. The case against Mr. Finch certainly possessed surface logic, yet something about its neat conclusions troubled her understanding of human nature and village dynamics. She had observed Mr. Finch for years, noting his timid demeanor and tendency toward nervous prostration when confronted with even minor difficulties. At the previous summer's village fete, she had watched him struggle to erect a simple stall, requiring Mrs. Clement's assistance to manage basic knots and fastenings. Such clumsiness hardly suggested the swift, decisive action required for successful strangulation, particularly of someone as composed and socially adept as Mrs. Fairfax. Moreover, the crime scene details nagged at her methodical mind. The artificial violet scent that had lingered in the anteroom seemed oddly feminine for Mr. Finch's involvement, whose personal atmosphere ran more toward antiseptic and old paper. The measuring tape's position suggested familiarity with needlework supplies rather than desperate improvisation, and the missing locket implied personal rather than purely financial motives. Most significantly, Miss Marple recognized the psychological chasm between blackmail and murder. Mr. Finch possessed the calculating patience required for systematic extortion, but lacked the cold resolve necessary for physical violence. His nervous energy manifested in stammering and avoidance, not the brutal efficiency that had characterized Mrs. Fairfax's death. The victim's behavior at Wednesday's sewing circle also contradicted the inspector's theory. Despite her obvious anxiety, Mrs. Fairfax had seemed more resigned than terrified, as if expecting resolution rather than escalation. Her careful attention to her needlework and polite conversation suggested someone preparing for negotiation, not fearing for her life. As Inspector Slack prepared his arrest warrant, Miss Marple found herself hoping that Mr. Finch's obvious guilt would not prevent examination of the village's deeper currents, where artificial violets, missing lockets, and unspooled measuring tapes might reveal truths more complex than simple blackmail gone wrong. Miss Marple's return to the Memorial Hall on Saturday morning carried the innocent purpose of retrieving her forgotten thimble, though her true interest lay in examining what Inspector Slack's efficient investigation might have overlooked. The hall stood empty, filled with that peculiar stillness that settles over places where ordinary life has been violently interrupted. The anteroom remained sealed with official tape, but Miss Marple's experienced eye could catalogue significant details through the doorway. The scattered contents of the supply cupboard lay exactly as they had been discovered, awaiting further examination by authorities who understood evidence but perhaps not the subtle habits of village needleworkers. What struck her immediately was the arrangement of the silk thread storage drawer, which sat slightly ajar on its lower shelf. Mrs. Bantry had distinctly recalled Mrs. Fairfax announcing her intention to fetch a fresh skein of silk thread in dove grey. Yet the drawer's contents told a different story entirely. The small wooden partitions remained perfectly aligned, each delicate skein nestled undisturbed in its designated compartment. The section marked Greys contained several options, all neatly coiled and untouched, showing no sign that anyone had rummaged through them seeking a particular shade. Miss Marple understood the significance immediately. Mrs. Fairfax, meticulous in all her habits, would never have left such specialized storage in pristine condition after locating her desired thread. The drawer's undisturbed state suggested she had never actually searched for the dove-gray silk, despite her stated intention. Her errand had been a pretext, a convenient excuse for leaving the sewing circle without alarming her companions. This revelation cast Mrs. Fairfax's final movements in an entirely different light. Rather than seeking supplies, she had been meeting someone in the anteroom, someone who had arranged the encounter under the cover of the sewing circle's familiar routine. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the measuring tape that had been found unspooled near the body. Inspector Slack had seized upon it as the obvious murder weapon, but closer examination revealed a detail that undermined his theory entirely. A small pink thread marked the 12-inch point, the precise, fussy repair that Miss Hartnell had made the previous spring when the tape had split. Miss Marple remembered the incident clearly, as Miss Hartnell had been particularly proud of her needlework solution. The measuring tape belonged to Miss Hartnell, not to some desperate improvisation by Mr. Finch. Its presence suggested either that Miss Hartnell herself had been involved, or that someone familiar with the sewing circle's equipment had used it for purposes far removed from measurement. The lingering artificial violet scent provided another piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple had noticed a small bottle of violet water among the scattered supplies, nearly empty and bearing no identifying label. The scent was distinctly old-fashioned, favored by women of a certain generation who valued tradition over modern preferences. This detail narrowed the field of potential users considerably, as younger women typically chose lighter, more contemporary fragrances. Her examination was interrupted by the arrival of young Biddy Pierce, who appeared with her usual quiet efficiency to collect forgotten items from the previous day's gathering. The girl's nervous demeanor had intensified since the murder, and Miss Marple noted with interest that the delicate chain Biddy typically wore at her throat was conspicuously absent, leaving a pale line where it had rested against her skin. "Such a terrible business," Biddy murmured, her soft voice barely audible. Mrs. Fairfax was always so particular about her things. She never would have left her needlework unfinished by choice. Miss Marple agreed gently, observing how Biddy's hands trembled slightly as she gathered teacups. The girl's intimate knowledge of each lady's habits and preferences made her an invaluable source of information, yet her obvious distress suggested she possessed knowledge that troubled her conscience. As Miss Marple made her way home, she reflected on the growing complexity of what Inspector Slack considered a straightforward case. The evidence pointed toward careful planning rather than desperate improvisation, involving someone who understood both the sewing circle's routines and Mrs. Fairfax's personal habits well enough to arrange a private meeting under the most innocent of circumstances. The undisturbed silk drawer, the measuring tape's true ownership, and the mysterious violet scent formed a pattern that suggested the murder had been committed by someone within their intimate circle, someone who had used the familiar setting and trusted relationships to mask deadly intentions. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay hidden beneath layers of village propriety and long-standing friendships, waiting to be uncovered by someone patient enough to notice the small inconsistencies that revealed larger deceptions. The arrest of Mr. Finch sent ripples of satisfaction through St. Mary Mead, yet Miss Marple observed that the village's collective relief carried an undercurrent of nervous energy, as if the residents feared their own secrets might surface under official scrutiny. Monday morning brought unexpected developments when Inspector Slack returned to the chemist's shop with questions that had occurred to him during a sleepless night spent reviewing evidence. Mr. Finch, pale and trembling in his cell, finally revealed the truth that transformed the entire case. "I never blackmailed Mrs. Fairfax," he confessed, his voice barely audible. "She came to me 6 months ago, asking for help with correspondence. She needed envelopes, stamps, and my discretion. She said she was conducting inquiries about certain village matters that required delicate handling." The revelation struck Inspector Slack like a physical blow. Mrs. Fairfax had not been a victim of blackmail, but rather someone conducting her own investigation, using Mr. Finch's services to maintain anonymity while she gathered information about her neighbors. The regular payments documented in his ledger represented fees for postal services, not extortion money. She was always so particular about privacy. Finch continued, wringing his hands. She said some people in the village weren't quite what they seemed, and she felt a responsibility to uncover the truth. The final £50 was payment for a comprehensive report she'd commissioned from a London agency. Miss Marple absorbed this information while considering its implications for the physical evidence. Her afternoon visit to Miss Hartnell yielded crucial details about the measuring tape that had been found unspooled near Mrs. Fairfax's body. Miss Hartnell's initial indignation about the tape's misuse gradually gave way to reluctant admission. "I lent it to young Biddy Pierce last week," she confessed, her assertive manner faltering. "She claimed she needed it for hemming the Harvest Festival bunting. Such a scatterbrained girl, always forgetting her own supplies. I never imagined it would be used for such a terrible purpose." The connection between Biddy Pierce and the murder weapon created a new avenue of investigation. Miss Marple's gentle inquiry with the young woman revealed a confession that shed light on several mysteries simultaneously. Biddy, her face streaked with tears, produced Mrs. Fairfax's missing locket from her apron pocket. "I didn't mean to keep it," she whispered, her hands shaking as she opened the delicate gold case. Mrs. Fairfax dropped it when she stumbled, and I picked it up. Inside was a photograph of a young man, very handsome, with the initials R.G. etched on the back along with a date from 30 years ago. The locket's contents suggested Mrs. Fairfax had harbored romantic secrets from her youth, memories she had kept close to her heart despite her practical marriage to the textile merchant. Miss Marple recognized the psychological significance of such keepsakes, understanding how past loves could influence present actions in ways that surprised even their bearers. The artificial violet scent that had lingered in the anteroom found its explanation through Miss Marple's discreet inquiries at the village shops. Mr. Hemingway at the general store confirmed that only one person regularly purchased the old-fashioned violet water, Mrs. Clement, who claimed it reminded her of her late mother. "She bought a fresh bottle just last week," he recalled, polishing his spectacles thoughtfully. "Said she was preparing gift sachets for the elderly ladies in the parish. Very thoughtful of her, though I can't say the scent appeals to modern tastes." Mrs. Clement's presence in the anteroom before the sewing circle began suddenly took on new significance. Her explanation about tidying the supply cupboard and preparing parish gifts provided reasonable cover for her movements, yet it also established her opportunity to arrange a private meeting with Mrs. Fairfax. As these revelations accumulated, Miss Marple began to perceive the outline of a more complex crime than Inspector Slack's straightforward theory had suggested. Mrs. Fairfax's role as an amateur investigator rather than a blackmail victim created multiple motives for murder among people who had secrets worth protecting. The measuring tape in Biddy's possession, the locket containing evidence of hidden romance, and the violet scent connecting to Mrs. Clement formed a triangle of evidence that pointed toward crimes of passion and desperation rather than simple financial extortion. Most significantly, Mrs. Fairfax's methodical nature suggested she would have confronted her discoveries systematically, offering each person an opportunity for private explanation before taking further action. Such confrontations, Miss Marple understood, could drive even gentle people to desperate measures when their carefully constructed lives faced exposure. The village's peaceful surface had concealed currents of deception and fear that now threatened to destroy the very fabric of their community, leaving Miss Marple to untangle the deadly consequences of secrets that should have remained buried. Tuesday morning brought developments that transformed Mrs. Fairfax's murder from a village scandal into something far more complex and dangerous. Miss Marple discovered a small envelope pushed beneath her garden gate, containing a single sheet of cream paper bearing a message in block capitals. "The truth about R.G. dies with Evelyn. Let sleeping dogs lie." The paper bore the faint scent of violets and a watermark suggesting expensive stationery, details that spoke of someone with both resources and desperation. The initials R.G. immediately connected to the photograph in Mrs. Fairfax's locket, creating the first concrete link between her investigation and the mysterious romantic figure from her past. Miss Marple's discreet inquiries at the village records office, conducted under the innocent pretext of researching parish history, revealed that 30 years earlier, a young man named Ronald Green had worked as head gardener at Gossington Hall before departing under circumstances that had generated considerable gossip. Inspector Slack, chastened by his premature arrest of Mr. Finch, approached these new revelations with greater caution. His investigation into Ronald Green uncovered a scandal that had rocked the village 3 decades past. The theft of £200 from the Gossington Hall Restoration Fund, money that had vanished along with the young gardener who had been courting several local girls simultaneously. Green was never formally charged, Inspector Slack reported to Miss Marple during their afternoon consultation. The evidence was circumstantial, and the family preferred to handle the matter privately. But the missing money coincided exactly with his disappearance, and there were whispers about romantic entanglements that may have motivated the theft. The connection between past and present became clearer when young Biddy Pierce, her conscience finally overcoming her fear, revealed additional details about the afternoon of the murder. She had noticed Mrs. Fairfax examining a small photograph during the sewing circle, holding it with the careful attention one reserves for precious memories. More significantly, she had observed Mrs. Clement's reaction when Mrs. Fairfax mentioned receiving correspondence from London. Mrs. Clement dropped her needlework, Biddy whispered, her voice barely audible. She went quite pale and asked specifically about the nature of the correspondence. When Mrs. Fairfax mentioned genealogical research, Mrs. Clement excused herself for nearly 10 minutes, claiming she needed fresh air. Miss Marple absorbed this information while considering its implications for the physical evidence. Mrs. Clement's family had deep roots in the village, her father having served as estate manager at Gossington Hall during the period of Ronald Green's employment. The genealogical research Mrs. Fairfax had commissioned could have uncovered connections that certain people preferred to keep buried. The investigation took a darker turn when Inspector Slack discovered that someone had attempted to break into Mrs. Fairfax's cottage during the previous night. The intruder had focused specifically on her desk and filing cabinet, suggesting they sought particular documents rather than valuables. Scratches around the lock indicated professional skill, yet the abandoned attempt suggested the intruder had been interrupted or had found what they were seeking. Most tellingly, the cottage's small garden shed had been thoroughly searched, with Mrs. Fairfax's gardening journals scattered across the floor. These journals, dating back 15 years, contained detailed records of her correspondence with various horticultural societies and historical preservation groups. Several pages had been torn out, leaving gaps in the chronological record that suggested someone had removed specific information about Gossington Hall's grounds and their historical significance. Dr. Haydock's examination of the scene revealed traces of the same artificial violet scent that had lingered in the Memorial Hall anteroom, confirming that the intruder was connected to the original murder. The killer was clearly attempting to eliminate evidence that could expose their connection to the Ronald Green scandal, demonstrating a desperation that made them increasingly dangerous. Miss Marple's evening constitutional past the vicarage yielded one final, crucial observation. Mrs. Clement's usually immaculate garden showed signs of recent disturbance near the compost heap, where someone had been digging in the soft earth. A small fragment of cream paper, partially decomposed but bearing the distinctive watermark from the threatening letter, lay half buried among the garden refuse. As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from these revelations. Someone with intimate knowledge of the village's history was systematically destroying evidence that connected them to both the historical theft and the recent murder. The escalating desperation suggested they would soon make the kind of mistake that would expose their carefully guarded secret, provided someone was patient enough to set the proper trap. The truth about Ronald Green and his connection to the present crisis was beginning to emerge, revealing a web of deception that had entangled multiple generations of village families in its deadly embrace. Miss Marple's invitation to afternoon tea carried the innocent purpose of organizing a memorial tribute for Mrs. Fairfax, though her true intention lay in conducting the most delicate of psychological experiments. She had chosen her cottage's sitting room with careful consideration, its intimate atmosphere and familiar comforts providing the perfect setting for observations that required the subtlest of human reactions. The autumn light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows that would allow her to study faces without appearing to scrutinize them too closely. Mrs. Clement arrived with her customary punctuality, bearing a small bouquet of late chrysanthemums and wearing her most composed expression despite the strain that showed in the careful way she arranged her gloves and the slight hesitation before she accepted her teacup. Miss Marple noted with particular interest that the vicar's wife had chosen a different perfume today, something light and powdery that replaced her usual violet water with studied casualness. Miss Hartnell followed shortly after, her assertive bonnet prepared for any social weather, while young Biddy Pierce slipped in quietly with her basket of mending, her presence adding the comfortable domesticity that made serious conversations seem merely incidental to the business of village life. Miss Marple poured tea from her best china service, the ritual providing cover for the careful orchestration she had planned. Such a tragedy about poor Evelyn's cottage being disturbed, Miss Marple observed, her needles clicking with gentle rhythm as she worked on ecclesiastical embroidery. One wonders what the intruder sought among her papers. She had mentioned receiving such fascinating correspondence from that London genealogical agency about local family histories. Mrs. Clement's reaction was precisely calibrated, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes before she responded with careful neutrality. Genealogical research can be quite absorbing, though one sometimes wonders if the past is better left undisturbed. Miss Marple continued with innocent enthusiasm, describing the remarkable discoveries Mrs. Fairfax had made about estate workers and their descendants, particularly those connected to Gossington Hall 30 years past. She mentioned, with apparent casualness, the photograph found in Mrs. Fairfax's locket, the handsome young man with the initials R.G., who had made such an impression on several local families. The psychological pressure mounted as Miss Marple rose to adjust a stubborn window latch, commenting on the particular technique required for the older mechanisms. One must lift first, then pull sharply, she demonstrated with gentle efficiency. Dr. Haydock mentioned it's precisely the same method needed for those narrow windows in the Memorial Hall anteroom. Such useful knowledge for someone familiar with the building's peculiarities. Mrs. Clement's fingers moved unconsciously to her throat, where she typically wore her mother's cameo brooch, finding only empty air in a gesture that betrayed profound nervousness. Her breathing became shallow as Miss Marple retrieved a small bottle of violet water from her work basket, commenting on its old-fashioned charm while removing the stopper briefly. Such a distinctive scent, Miss Marple mused, setting the bottle carefully on the table between them. One notices it particularly in enclosed spaces. Evelyn mentioned detecting it in the anteroom that afternoon, though she couldn't identify its source at the time. The effect was immediate and telling. Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer, and she reached instinctively for her handbag, clutching it with the desperate grip of someone protecting vital secrets. Her composed facade began to fracture as Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, describing the London agency's discoveries about marriage certificates and family connections that might surprise even those who thought they knew their own histories. The agency found it particularly interesting, Miss Marple continued with devastating casualness, how certain witness signatures on historical documents could be traced to current village residents. Witnesses have such remarkable memories for faces and circumstances, especially when money or reputation might be involved. Mrs. Clement rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with uncharacteristic clumsiness. "I'm afraid I must return to the vicarage," she stammered, her voice barely steady. "My husband will be expecting his evening meal." Miss Marple watched her departure with the satisfaction of someone whose careful experiment had yielded precisely the expected results. The psychological test had succeeded beyond her hopes, confirming suspicions that had crystallized through weeks of patient observation. Mrs. Clement's reactions had revealed not merely guilt, but the specific nature of that guilt, the desperate fear of exposure that had driven her to murder rather than face the shame of family secrets being revealed. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Mrs. Fairfax's death. The victim's methodical research into village history had uncovered truths that certain people would kill to keep buried, transforming innocent genealogical curiosity into a deadly threat that had cost both women far more than either had ever imagined possible. The stage was now set for the final revelation, when all the carefully gathered threads would be woven together into an undeniable pattern of guilt and the gentle but inexorable justice that Miss Marple had learned to administer with such devastating effectiveness. Inspector Slack arrived at the Memorial Hall on Thursday evening with the reluctant acknowledgement that Miss Marple's gentle summons typically preceded revelations that would reshape his understanding of village crime. The assembled group created an atmosphere of tense expectation. Mrs. Bantry with her determined composure, Dr. Haydock bearing his professional gravity, Miss Hartnell planted like a sentinel, and young Biddy Pierce clutching her mending basket with white-knuckled intensity. Miss Marple sat where the autumn light fell across the long table, her needlework depicting the same garden scene that Mrs. Fairfax would never complete. "Thank you all for coming," she began with characteristic gentleness. "I thought it best to settle this matter before fear and suspicion do more damage to our community than the truth itself ever could." Mrs. Clement entered quietly, her face pale but composed, taking the chair that had been left pulled out in unconscious echo of that fatal afternoon. Miss Marple observed her with compassionate but unwavering attention, noting how the vicar's wife had abandoned her customary violet water in favor of an unfamiliar powder scent. "The truth about Evelyn's death," Miss Marple continued with quiet authority, "lies not in blackmail or random violence, but in a 30-year-old secret that someone was desperate to protect. Mrs. Fairfax's genealogical research had uncovered something that threatened to destroy a carefully maintained reputation, something that seemed worth killing to preserve." Inspector Slack opened his notebook, though his pen remained motionless as Miss Marple began her methodical exposition. "You see, Inspector, Mrs. Fairfax had discovered that the theft from the Gossington Hall Restoration Fund 30 years ago was not committed by Ronald Green, the young gardener who disappeared. Her research revealed that the actual thief was the estate manager of the time, a respected man whose daughter still lives among us." Mrs. Clement's teacup rattled against its saucer, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. Miss Marple continued with devastating precision, her voice never losing its gentle cadence. "The estate manager was your father, Vera. Ronald Green, that handsome young man whose photograph Evelyn kept in her locket, was innocent of theft, but guilty of capturing several young hearts, including Evelyn's own. When the money went missing, your father allowed suspicion to fall on the departed gardener rather than confess his own desperate act. The revelation struck the assembled group with the force of long-suppressed truth finally emerging into daylight. Mrs. Clement's carefully maintained facade cracked as Miss Marple explained the careful construction of the crime that had cost Mrs. Fairfax her life. "Evelyn arranged to meet you privately in the anteroom that afternoon, using the pretext of fetching dove-gray silk thread. She was always fair-minded, always willing to give people the opportunity to explain themselves before taking action. She had no intention of causing unnecessary scandal, merely seeking to clear Ronald Green's name after all these years." Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle rhythm as she described the murder itself. "You used your familiarity with the Memorial Hall to prepare the scene, claiming you needed to arrange supplies for parish gifts. The violet water provided perfect cover for your presence there, though its artificial scent lingered long enough for Evelyn to notice. You borrowed Miss Hartnell's measuring tape through Biddy, knowing it would be available in the supply cupboard. The physical evidence fell into place with mathematical precision as Miss Marple continued her exposition. The window was opened beforehand to suggest an external intruder, though you knew exactly how to operate that stubborn latch from years of parish work. When Evelyn arrived for your meeting, you sat together in apparent civility before your conversation turned to confrontation. Mrs. Clement's voice emerged as barely a whisper. She said she understood about family loyalty, about protecting those we love, but she insisted that Ronald's name must be cleared, that the truth owed him that much dignity. She reached for her bag to show me the genealogical report, and I saw that she had gathered enough evidence to prove everything. Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding. The measuring tape was soft and silent, an improvised ligature that required no strength, only desperate resolve. You took Evelyn's locket to remove the photograph that had inspired her research, though you dropped it in your haste where Biddy later found it. Inspector Slack found his voice at last. The break-in at Mrs. Fairfax's cottage, the threatening note under Miss Marple's gate, desperate attempts to destroy evidence and frighten away further investigation, Miss Marple replied. But fear creates the very attention it seeks to avoid, and guilt leaves traces that patient observation can always detect. As Mrs. Clement began to weep, the tragic irony of the situation became clear to all present. Mrs. Fairfax's discretion would have protected the family secret while quietly clearing an innocent man's name. But fear had transformed gentle inquiry into deadly confrontation, leaving the village to mourn, not one victim, but two women whose lives had been destroyed by the weight of hidden histories that need never have proven fatal. The arrest of Mrs. Clement passed through St. Mary Mead like autumn frost, settling into every corner of village life with quiet devastation. Inspector Slack departed with his prisoner in the police motor car, while the vicar stood motionless in his garden, watching 30 years of marriage disappear into an uncertain future. The community that had gathered in the memorial hall dispersed with unusual silence, each person carrying the uncomfortable knowledge that respectability could mask the most desperate of crimes. Miss Marple spent the following morning organizing Mrs. Fairfax's effects, which had been returned by the authorities. Among them was the final genealogical report from the London agency, a thick document that would have cleared Ronald Green's name while offering the Clement family a dignified path toward private acknowledgement of past mistakes. The tragedy lay not in the secret itself, but in the fear that had prevented reasonable resolution. A subsequent letter from Toronto confirmed that Green had emigrated, married respectably, and died some years before, leaving neither scandal nor fortune, only a park bench bearing his name and the simple dates that comprised a life. Young Biddy Pierce proved more resilient than anyone had expected, her quiet efficiency helping maintain village routines while the community processed its collective shock. She had returned Mrs. Fairfax's locket to Miss Marple, who ensured it accompanied the funeral flowers as a final gesture of remembrance. The girl's experience with the investigation had matured her beyond her years, lending her observations a gravity that older residents found both touching and reassuring. The memorial hall stood empty for several weeks before Mrs. Bantry courageously organized the resumption of their sewing circle. The group met initially at the vicarage parlor, their needles clicking with determined normalcy while carefully avoiding mention of recent events. When they finally returned to their traditional venue, Mrs. Fairfax's chair remained empty for months, a silent memorial that gradually became part of their accepted landscape. Miss Hartnell reclaimed her measuring tape from the police with characteristic efficiency, though she admitted privately that she could never again use it without remembering its terrible purpose. The implement now resided in her sewing basket like a talisman of mortality, a reminder that the most innocent objects could become instruments of destruction when desperation overcame moral restraint. Dr. Haydock observed the village's recovery with professional interest, noting how communities heal through gradual restoration of ordinary patterns. The Autumn Harvest Festival proceeded as planned, though without Mrs. Fairfax's expert needlework and Mrs. Clement's organizational skills. The quilts were completed by willing hands, their stitches perhaps less perfect, but their creation marked by solidarity that tragedy had unexpectedly strengthened. The vicar continued his pastoral duties with quiet dignity, his sermons taking on deeper resonance as he spoke from experience about forgiveness, redemption, and the human capacity for both good and evil. The congregation responded to his grief with increased devotion, understanding that their spiritual leader had paid a terrible price for his service to their community. Mrs. Fairfax's cottage was eventually sold to a young family from Much Benham, people with no connection to village history and no interest in genealogical research. The garden maintained its meticulous appearance under new hands, though the roses seemed somehow less vibrant than they had under their original mistress's careful cultivation. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, conversations carried new undertones of caution, as if residents had learned that their neighbors might harbor secrets more dangerous than anyone had previously imagined. The comfortable assumption of shared values and transparent motivations had been replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature's capacity for deception. Miss Marple resumed her customary constitutional through the village, her keen eye noting how crisis had subtly altered familiar relationships and social patterns. She completed her ecclesiastical embroidery as Christmas approached, creating a garden scene that would have pleased Mrs. Fairfax's artistic sensibilities. The finished work would hang in the church vestry, a quiet memorial to the woman whose curiosity about the past had cost her any chance of enjoying the future. From her cottage window, Miss Marple often observed the memorial hall, where the sewing circle had returned to its normal rhythm. The chair that had been left pulled out in that welcoming angle was eventually returned to its proper position, though some afternoons it seemed to retain the ghostly impression of its former occupant. In the end, she reflected, truth possessed its own moral imperative, though the price of revelation sometimes proved higher than anyone should have to pay. The village had learned that even in the coziest corners of life, vigilance was required, for the darkness within human nature could never be entirely banished, only understood and, when necessary, brought to light.